Good day to you. From Anagalactic on Saturday, May 16th of 2026. Up here you'll see the title of a book written somewhat over 900 years ago, but just recently produced. This comes from Saudi Arabia. It is printed in English, but it's translated from the Arabic by a wonderful scholar whom I think may be the greatest scholar of all time, and his name is al-Ghazali. He has a more complete name that's well worth knowing. If you love the Arabic language as much as I do, and if you don't, you may not have ever heard Arabic. It is certainly a wonderful language. It is a different language completely than English. It has a completely different structure when you get down to what we need to know about what such a man is saying. Now, it's not necessary to actually explore the difference in structure between Arabic and English. And the only reason I bring it up is because the Quran, which of course is the central book in Islam, is in an old form of Arabic, over 1,200 years old. And it was written down as it was recited by Muhammad. And because it's in the Arabic tongue, and it is actually a transmission from a higher level of reality, actually through the mouth of an angel, I should say the mind of an angel, who actually visited Muhammad. And this is well recorded. Everyone who knew Muhammad generally subsequently called the companions, those who were actually with Muhammad when he was reciting what he was told by an angel, who is actually named, he's a very well-known angel, an angel by the name of Gabriel. I've given several video presentations on this subject, which is Islam, the Quran, and what is called the Hadith, which is the tradition which is always attached to a religion. Of course, Islam is the major religion of earth, and it has been for well over 1,000 years now. For those of us who are almost certainly more acquainted with the religion of Christianity, this raises some interesting prospects to our view as Westerners. The Islam people are Easterners, although that has changed in modern times. Of course, you would also be able to say that the original Christians were Easterners. So both of these religions spread across the earth, and it is proper to say, I would certainly say, that they are the two major religions of earth. Why are we covering religion when this is a science station? It is because of the confluence between religion and science, which I discovered on my own, which is how all scientists must discover things. But you can use the word discovery in two completely different ways. Well, not completely different. A discovery has to be in an individual mind. But if you're the first person to have discovered something, well, then it is called a discovery in a different sense. And that has to do with the province of science, that you would then have to prove what you discovered, or why would anybody else want to know it? So that's the basis of rational logic, is to have choices in order to make a rational decision on some question that is either proposed to you or you have proposed in your own research. But it's the same process that you try to make a decision based on rational logic. And what does that mean? Rational logic is essentially binary. It comes down to true and false. Of course, we're well acquainted with that in modern times in circuit logic, which uses binary representation, which simply means that you have either an on or an off circuit, often called a gate in another context, whereby the computer actually uses a form of rationality. And what is meant by that? Very important to have a precise definition of what is meant by rationality, because that is the basis of the form of logic that we use to do science. What about in religion? We'll get to that in a moment, but there is a connection between the two. The title of this book in English can be said in one of approximately 3 ways. The way it's printed here is Revival of Religion's Sciences. That is, revival of the possessive form of religion, that is, belonging to religion, sciences plural. The revival of religion's sciences. That is not the most common English translation. The revival of religious science is the more singular form, but it can also be translated in another way, all of which is to say that this is the confluence of religion with science. Now, as I began by saying, science is based on rational logic. We have a tremendous wind. About 20 miles an hour. It's just raging through the trees. It's dawn here on this Saturday, and so that's why I glanced. It's making quite a racket outside. I don't believe you can hear it. To return to our subject, this book was written by al-Ghazali, who is considered to be, in Islam, one of the foremost scholars of all time. In my opinion, he is the greatest scholar of all time anywhere. Although that's kind of like the beauty pageant contest, which is always a subjective point of view. We are human, I included, certainly, and so we are subjective, but in science we try not to be subjective. That is, we try not to let our feelings, really anything other than rational logic, dictate our conclusions. It's somewhat unavoidable with humans, though, and this does go to the other side of a human. We are rational beings. It distinguishes us from the species of animals and, of course, plants and so forth, that humans are quite distinct because of rational logic. It is debatable whether the higher forms of mammals, for instance, even birds, may have a form of rationality. That is, they are capable of making decisions, but without going into the philosophical side of that, it is quite fair to say, and this can be supported in a debate situation, where the debate, of course, is meant to elicit further understanding from something that may not be just as plain as day, black or white. We are overlapping systems, and I claim that we are exactly, no more and no less, 2 systems. This, of course, depends on one's classificational approach to that topic of what is a human. It can very well be said, as I do say, that we have exactly 2 sides. One of them is emotional. Emotional, that covers a wide range, but when you compare it with the alternative, you could say irrational, that's the opposite of rationality, but in this case it's not a direct opposite. It's a different system. We have a rational logical system, which we apply, and we learn to use it. The other side of us we don't need to learn at all. It's the emotional side, which is driven by chemicals. It's chemicals that pass through the blood and affect the way a person, we would say, thinks, but it's really the way a person feels. And when dealing with these two sides of a human, I find it absolutely critical to distinguish between those two sides. Because if you don't distinguish between how a person relates to their environment, including other human beings, including one's own self, informing one's perspective, orientation, etc., you must take into consideration both sides. A human is almost completely dominated by emotions. A moment's thought will convince you of that if you just trace back your own development as a human. How did you begin? Of course, in infancy. Were you able to think? No, you were not able to think. Before a certain threshold, there are no thought processes going on in a newborn baby. It has nothing to think about. Now, in the spookier side of philosophy, of course, men are inevitably drawn to just question everything, but here we need to just be practical. Eventually, a human does learn how to use that system, and it is a system that's blueprinted into every human being by DNA. It's a coded system, and the entire organism of a human being, as indeed all living things on Earth, being cellular organisms, consist of a code. It is a code, and that was discovered in my lifetime with the discovery of the innate structure down to a very microscopic level, to put it mildly. The code has been discovered. It's one of the most significant discoveries in the history of mankind. Now, we do know then that everything about a human is coded. Whatever we do, in some sense, it was determined ahead of time. And that has a philosophical name called determinism. Determinism is a mechanistic way of looking at human reality. It's also very important to remember at all times that we're talking about human reality. Human reality is not mechanistic, not in any way that you could name or defend. It's entirely subjective, for the obvious reason that a human being is completely self-reliant. There is a footnote to that, which is brought up in this book and constitutes the entire book, is that we are both at the same time mechanistic and deterministic based on the code that makes us. It's coded what we are. So that is one aspect of a most interesting superposition. Superposition is a word I've taught you out of the work of such great men as Dirac and Bohm and the others who deal with quantum mechanics, which is based and can be defined as a superpositional system. If you are not acquainted with the use of that word in its scientific application at the quantum level, I have several videos that I've devoted to that subject. But superposition, as I have extrapolated it, is a much more powerful concept than was ever realized by the mechanists. Superposition is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the two subsystems that define a human, that define what a human is. One aspect of this duality, a superposition, is a kind of duality, but there's a hierarchy. In other words, it's not a left-right or top-bottom. It's not binary. It's a conjugation, which is a fancy-dancy word that has to be defined. It can be used in several ways. It is a mathematical term. But I have also discovered, is one of the aspects of my major discovery in geometry, that there is such a thing as superposition in geometry, and nobody ever realized that. That geometry itself is a superposition of what? It's a superposition of two completely different systems. And when I say completely, that would have to have a footnote. I'm simply emphasizing that there are two geometries. Euclid discovered one of them. I discovered the other, the geometry of curvature. So that does have to do with superposition, and I'm now using the word superposition, which means two layers, which cannot be separated. Electromagnetism is the perfect example of superposition, because there's no such thing as electroforce without magnetoforce. They always occur together. Always occur together. If there's magnetoforce, which we call magnetism, then there is also electroforce, and that's called electricity. Fairly said. But they are two forces. So that's an example from physics of superposition. What we're looking at here is superposition as I apply the word to a human, whereby one part of the superposition, which cannot be separated from the other part, is pure logic. It's a specific form of logic, and there are several kinds of logic, which is a good study. I am a logician, and so I've made it my life's work to know everything I can know about logic. And there's quite a list of different forms of logic. You probably could name a few right offhand. Binary logic is one kind, but there are other forms of logic. A man named Peirce, whose name is spelled with the I-E backwards, from the rule, I before E except after C. Well, his name is not Pierce, it's Peirce, because the I and the E are separate, are switched. And he lived, I believe about a century ago. I may need to look that up, but he's the man to consult if you would like an overview of what kinds of logic exist. He is one of the classical experts on that subject. Now, I am claiming, because it can be proved, that we do have this subsystem built into us by the code. The code. Where does that code come from? Because generally speaking, if you have a code, you have a cryptographer. Does nature just make up a code? Well, there is a theory that says just that DNA is simply a mechanically derived code. In other words, the universe came up with this without any thought ahead of time. In other words, there's no such thing as design. There's no such thing as design. That's the meaning of mechanism, that there's no design. It just happens. It's just the way it is. There is no explanation for the DNA code. Now, you may be aware that there is a considerable model developed just just barely 150 years ago, really, it arose in England a mechanistic model of essentially what would come to be discovered to be DNA. But the name that always pops to mind is Darwin, Charles Darwin, who wrote two very famous books, but it was the first one that really made the splash. And Darwin definitely had a new theory, although he had predecessors and even contemporaries who had basically derived the same concept, that the biological diversity that we see across the face of the earth, just very roughly speaking and rounding down, there are approximately 1 million separate animal species. There are approximately 1 million, actually closer to 2 million, plant species. And there are some smaller organisms, single-celled organisms, that have their own kingdom now. Although when I was in school in the 1960s, there really was only the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. So the biological diversity, which we call the species, are about 2 to 3 million. And that requires some explanation. Is there a mechanistic explanation? According to strict science, it has to be mechanistic. There has to be a mechanism of production of that code. And we're talking about 3 million, minimum, 3 million completely separate codes. Completely separate. That's what it is meant by a species. That a species, such as a certain kind of finch, or a certain kind of cow, or a certain kind of orchid, a certain kind of anything in the ecology on the face of this planet, has the same DNA structure. And there's different kinds of DNA, and you may be more acquainted with that subject than I am, although I'm always trying to learn more. It's an amazing subject, is DNA. But it's a code, and it doesn't change. It simply does not change. There's a huge footnote to that. An enormous footnote to that. How can I make the claim that a species code cannot change? It is a bit over the top to say that it cannot change. And in fact, the entire model, which is usually attributed to Darwin, but incorrectly so, it was really developed after Darwin's death, without any knowledge of DNA. That came a full century later. In the the mid-20th century, within my lifetime, the DNA code was discovered. And that should have been the end of the biological evolutionary model, because the discovery of the DNA code is exactly what Darwin was afraid of. He admitted it only in one paragraph. Only in one paragraph did he admit what his actual attitude towards his theory was. His considered scientific opinion. He only said this once, but he put it in his book, the first book. It was in chapter 6, called Problems with the Theory. And he said that his theory was wrong. He could not have been more plain as day. Now, because this is now a religious topic, that it's now a new religion among the whites, the Western European white people, the modern industrialized white people. It's exclusive to Europe, which of course includes America now. And in the modern 21st century, you would have to say that I'm again going a bit over the top because, of course, there are scientists who subscribe to this model who exist in all cultures, not just white. But that's where it originated, and that's where it became a religion, a brand new religion, which just like the gays, who in my lifetime were said to come out of the closet, that they were tired of being second-class citizens when the only difference between a homosexual and heterosexual is an identity change. Sure, it involves some a change in, I guess you would say, habit or predilection. Well, you're a human being. You change your identity daily. I challenge you to remember what your identity was when you were 5 years old. Is it your same identity today? No one in their right mind would say that. So human beings change their identity as they grow. And of course, this allows a wide range of choices. Homosexuality has been around since the dawn of human history. And the only reason that it obtained a stigmatic, I guess, reputation is because it's different from the norm. Well, welcome to the human race. Each human being is different from the norm, or you wouldn't be an individual. We'd be ants. Now, this is not to defend or not defend a person's predilection, which in this case would be sexual. I can just tell you my own opinion. I don't see how that really matters. Why would you, categorize somebody other than the obvious, if a person says that they're homosexual, okay, then you are. I've worked shoulder to shoulder with a homosexual man who actually was very kind to me to say, if you ever decide, come to me first. And I appreciated that. What's wrong with that? He's not tempting me like he's the devil. I didn't think so. I still don't. And to this day, I have always gotten along perfectly well. I find it really tragic, in a way, that these people who simply have a different identity from the norm, Arthur C. Clarke, one of my favorite authors, was a homosexual. I didn't know that, but it doesn't really, I thought about it, I thought, really? It was his secretary who kind of spilled the beans. After Clarke was dead, Clarke, I don't know if he hid it or not consciously, but he was discreet. Nobody knew that he was a homosexual. Well, good. I mean, isn't that the best? You don't need to tell anybody what you are. It's what you are. You don't need to expose yourself to other people's opinions. But in the movement that really, I guess, really got underway in the 1960s when I was a very young man, this was a topic of, I guess, rights, human rights, because they were stigmatized. And there's something called bashing. I think you may have heard of this. Well, that's quite unfair. And the same thing applies to someone, I believe, who, is born with a certain skin color that doesn't match the norm. So what? That should be a source of joy, that we're different. Isn't that great? We're not stamped from the same die. We're individuals. So this applies to our subject of religion. religion. Because what I discovered on my own is that religion and science are like electroforce and magnetoforce. You cannot have one without the other. They define each other. So the emotional side of a human is what traditionally is considered to be the guiding system for a person's religious disposition. That is subjective because it's not scientific. In other words, it's not a rational decision. And men such as Richard Dawkins, who is on the verge of death now, it's a race between Noam Chomsky and Richard Dawkins. Which one of these men is going to die first? They're both deathly ill and super old, and they both have tremendous reputations. But Richard Dawkins got his reputation from being an atheist, which is now a bona fide religion. It's come out of the closet. It's a form of closeting that the atheists have been just hanging back, man. And it's a movement, certainly in America, but it began in England. You could say it maybe began before that, because human history is quite an interesting topic to trace the sources of things, such as a religion called atheism, which is a denial of all religion. Atheism means that you don't believe in a God. That implies much more than just you don't think that the concept of God is rational. Why would you say anything about that? It's because of religious oppression. In England, it was the Anglican Church, which is an arm of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church is based on one very simple religious statement. Jesus is God. Jesus is God? Well, if Jesus is God, just because the Pope says so, to use a cliche, I suppose you would say, because the church, Mother Church, the holy, orthodox, conservative, sola scriptura, Jesus is God. I don't know how you react to that statement, but that is the religion that dominated Europe and still dominates the lives of tens of millions of people to this day. An absolutely nonsensical statement. That can be disproved scientifically. And Muhammad was really the first man to turn that into a law. And Muhammad is the man who inspired al-Ghazali. Al-Ghazali lived only a few centuries after Muhammad. And what did Muhammad say about Christianity? Well, the way Muhammad found out about Christianity was with a delegation of Catholics. And the reason I say they were Catholics, this is back in the 600s, okay? So we're talking about quite a while ago. Only a few centuries after the appearance of Yeshua, whom Americans call Jesus. And Jesus really made quite a splash. He was an amazing prophet. Anybody, no matter what your feelings are about God or religion or whatever is your crybaby attitude towards what goes on with most people who have lived in all history, most people, by far, do have a religion, and they do believe in a God. It's just a question of what you add to that. And certainly Jesus added something to the Israeli transmission. He was an Israeli prophet. Strictly speaking, he was a Yehudan prophet because the 10 tribes of Israel, that is 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel, had been annihilated by God. And God said through several of his prophets, including Ezekiel, that he sorely wished that he could get rid of the Yehudans too. He hated them. He hated his own people because they were horrific. And so he destroyed really 11 out of the 12 tribes. It is said that Benjamin hung out with Judah. Ridiculous. Yehuda, that is the Yehudi tribe, is the only Israeli tribe left, and was the only Israeli tribe left long before the appearance of Yeshua. That is what the Americans called Jesus. So this was a major turning point in religion, was the appearance of a prophet who basically consummated the entire history of the Israeli race. 11/12 of which were gone. Of the 12 tribes, there was only one left at the time of the birth of Yeshua. And the reason that the Lord God of Israel, as it is said throughout the prophets, the only reason that he didn't destroy Judah, who is just as creepy and nasty and malign as the other Israeli tribes. And God got rid of 11 out of 12 of them, but he preserved the tribe of Yehuda because the elect one, the one who would eventually be called Hamashiach, the Messiah, a very special prophet, was destined to be born. And that one was prophesied to arise from the tribe of Judah, Yehuda. And so that's why they were still around. But as soon as Yeshua was done with his ministry, and I believe you know the story of what happened to him at the hands of his countrymen who were under foreign rule at the time, just a miserable bunch of murderers, as they still want to be now, which is a crazy, crazy thing. Because as soon as Yeshua was done with his ministry and left earth, as was observed by several thousand witnesses, he ascended to heaven. Now in Islam, they agree with that Yeshua is alive in heaven. But it's part of the tradition. It's not really in the Quran, but it's part of the tradition called the Hadith, which arose around Islam as it progressed, which is a natural development of any religion. They fully accept Yeshua as a prophet. Muhammad said that no one was closer to Isa, which is how they say Yeshua. No one was closer to Isa than himself, and he claimed this openly. So this is well documented. One of the greatest devotees, that is, followers, disciples of Yeshua, was Muhammad. Muhammad is what we would just informally say today. Muhammad was a Christian. And he had to be a Christian or he would not be a prophet, because Yeshua was a prophet, and there's no question about that. Was Muhammad a prophet? Yes. Yes, he was. How do I know that? We'll get to that. I have given several presentations in 2026 on my studies into Islam, which began only in 2025. So I'm a newcomer to Islam, and I claim, and I have been supported by this, by a few people have responded to my claim made online in these videos, that I am an Islam man. And I said on my own recognizance, I now realize that I was born Islam. And that got a very favorable response from the Islam community. I have quite a few people in the Islam community who tune in to hear what I say. because I'm one of those rare Westerners who absolutely fully understands Islam, which is extremely uncommon for a Westerner to know anything about Islam. And that has to do with the repression of the government against Islam, which now you see is being culminated. The attack on Iran needs to be reinterpreted. So I'm here to do that for you so you know what's going on. I'm not saying that I'm a prophet, but I know both sides of the fence now. And when I say both sides of the fence, I mean Christianity and Islam. But I mean more than that. I see everything perfectly clearly now, to a threshold, which I don't think other people can match, that I see the science side of religion and the religion side of science. And that has to do with superposition. Because religion and science are inextricably bound together. Well, the atheists don't seem to think so. Isn't that funny? Excuse my voice, I do have allergies, and we have a raging wind outside, which has stirred up so much stuff in the air that with my asthma, I do sometimes get a little choked up. I'll be back in a nanosecond. It'll take me about 5 minutes to just get refreshed so I don't keep sounding like I have something stuck in my throat. So thanks for putting up with first of all, my appearance. I haven't been able to afford a haircut for going on 2 years. I'm extremely poor. And I don't ever ask for money. I'm here to give. I'm here to share. I don't expect anything from my listeners, except hopefully you have more choices. So you're more free. Because without the choices, freedom is meaningless. And if you don't know anything about Islam, you don't have enough choices yet in your life. You may not be religious. Well, if you're scientifically oriented, you are religious whether you realize it or not. And the same thing is true of a religious person. Just because you're religious doesn't mean you can't be a scientist. They actually must go together. Al-Ghazali proved that. I proved it on a different vector. And so now we have a consensus. Both al-Ghazali and my name is Scott Miller, by the way, not that it matters for science, who comes up with what. But al-Ghazali and we be mates, pal. Just as Muhammad said that he was closest to Yeshua, and there were no prophets in between himself and Yeshua. He said that, and he, of course, is right. Muhammad is the last prophet. There won't be any more prophets, because he's the last. But he's not of the Israeli transmission. Yeshua was the last. You would have to include the one who finally wrote the book on behalf of Yeshua, and that man's name is John of Patmos, who wrote the book of Revelation, which we're going to get to, because that has the whole story of who's attacking Iran and why. All right, I'll wrap this up now to keep this under 45 minutes. I'll have another presentation a little later today. The sun is rising as I speak here on this Saturday. I wanted you to at least have a good framework, regardless of your religious inclinations, or none, which is quite common in the West now. No matter how you may regard your own religion or your lack thereof, as a scientist, you must be courageous. You must be able to face human situations. You may not fully agree with someone else's point of view, but if it's affecting, if it's something important at large, you do have to deal with it, because we're called upon as scientists to be leaders. We're guides. We're much more important than any president, much more important than any leader in the political sense. They're just figureheads. They just do what they do for money. Whatever underlies, it really is all about money, and I think you should probably accept that because it's so true. But, you know, there are two sides to politics as well. But when it comes to religion, if you don't have a rational apprehension of what it means for a person to say that they're a Christian, or say that they're Islam, or simply say that they believe in God, no matter how far they take it. They believe in angels, all Islam people do. Many Christians do too, but it just goes on and on and on. Well, what about the temple? Well, what about the Messiah? Well, what about, you know, it goes right into human culture. So if you're not aware of what 2 billion people believe, those would be Islam people, or you don't even care about what Christianity might or might not be, you just don't concern yourself with it, you're not fit to be called a scientist. You're worthless if you can't face these questions. And that'll be in the next presentation as I go into the world situation from a point of view of prophecy. I don't charge money for these video presentations. This is free to you. But I'll tell you what, the workman is worthy of his hire, so I hope you appreciate the fact that you're about to receive a full-fledged university course in world religion and in world politics as it's unfolding today that you simply will never, ever get anywhere else. Only I know what's actually going on, both in religion and in world politics. Only I know. So I hope you stay tuned for that presentation later today on this rather windy Saturday, and we'll also talk about the Sabbath and whether that's Saturday or not. I used to be a Seventh-day Adventist. I know, but we all have a history, don't we? All right, stay tuned. Keep looking up. If you ever get a chance to get outside at night, which you should make time for, take a look at the moon if she's visible. Just consider the stars. Best time you'll ever spend on Earth. We'll be right back. Thank you.